Hello and welcome to Liberty and Gun Rights Podcast. My name is James Moffitt, and I'll be your host. Today we have Josh Lewis. How are you doing, Josh Lewis?
Doing great, James. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thank you. I know we had to struggle a little bit with our schedules to make this happen, but I'm glad we did. Go ahead and introduce yourself to the listening audience, please.
Yeah, it wouldn't be a podcast recording without technical and schedule struggling, right? But hopefully that'll make it a better one.
That's right.
Name is Josh Lewis, as I say. I'm from Tulsa, Oklahoma, born and raised, lived in this vicinity. I work for the Oklahoma State Auditor's Office. We're the good guys. We audit not the taxpayer, but governments. And I'm kind of a jack of all trades. I play the banjo. I'm into running. I like cold water dipping. But probably the main reason you have me on this show is because I fancy myself to be a conservative, one who tries to take very serious the intellectual tradition of conservatism, understand what it is, where it came from, and maybe most importantly, how we can translate those ancient or older values into our modern political context.
Very good. Yes, I love that. So you're in Tornado Alley if you're in Oklahoma, right?
We are. In fact, this very week we've got some storms. I mean, who knows? Most of the time these things literally, no pun intended, blow over. But there's some nasty weather on the way, and you never know what it'll bring.
Well, I was raised in Quinlan, Texas, which is near Greenville, Texas, which is the geographic center of Northeast Texas. And I was raised around tornadoes. I saw one, at least once a month, and I remember when my dad, my sister and I were sitting in the back seat, and we went to go pick up my mother from her hairdresser. And it was a little tiny storage building that this lady used to do people's hair. And there was two twisters that sat down, one on each side of the buildings.
Wow.
And I was like, what? And they weren't massive. There was more like downspouts or like, whatever you call them.
Right. EF1s or 2s maybe.
Yeah, these were like little water spouts. They were real small, but they were if you hit anything, it would do some damage. So I just remember that. And then my wife and I lived in Atlanta, Georgia, and oh my God, there were times that me, my wife, and all our kids were downstairs in the middle bathroom because we thought we were going to die. And there were some massive tornadoes that come through, and luckily missed our neighborhood.
It's real. I have very mixed feelings about this. I have lived in Oklahoma my entire life, except for a couple of years I went off to college. I've never seen a tornado.
Really?
I don't know if that's just by God's grace. I mean, I would love to see one like way out in a prairie pasture somewhere. He's not hurting anybody.
Sure.
They're beautiful, and they're just awe-inspiring. They make you feel so humble and insignificant. Now, I've been really close encounters all the time, but usually it's at night. Sometimes tornadoes are rain-wrapped. We had one several years back. I have the good fortune of both of my grandmothers are still alive and live within half a mile of each other. And there was a tornado that went, so far as we could tell, directly over their house because it was spotted on the ground. But it was at night. And then I saw, according to the Doppler radar, it looked like it just went right through their neighborhood. Thank God, apparently it went up in the air and just skipped over their houses and kept going.
Oh, that's wonderful. I'm glad. So I guess you're not a storm chaser, huh?
I am not. Well, if I am, I'm a very poor storm chaser. I've never actually caught one.
If you ever seen the movies called Twister, they're pretty intense.
That it is. Twister's decent. A lot of times when Hollywood portrays tornadoes in film, it's obvious the people that do it have never seen a tornado themselves. But Twister's, it kind of gives you that eerie sense of, okay, this is kind of what it actually feels like to be in that situation.
Right. All right, so I'm going to read this little blurb off of your Podmatch profile.
I should have mentioned, by the way, in the introduction, I have a podcast, Saving Elephants, which I'm sure you'll be mentioning. I forgot to mention that earlier.
I see that. We'll talk about that. So your little blurb on your Podmatch profile, it says, explore the intersection of modern conservatism and constitutional liberties through the lens of political philosophy, casting light on how traditional conservative values align with principles of individual freedom and self-defense. So I like that. So tell us about Saving Elephants.
Well, Saving Elephants began as a project shortly after the 2016 election, and I'm one who have considered myself to be a conservative as far back as I've had a political memory, and have been a member of the Republican Party for as long as I've been able to be registered with a political party. But admittedly, my ideas of what conservatism is was essentially limited to whatever Rush Limbaugh happened to say that day on the radio. And I attribute Rush to giving me a good foundation, sort of starting me off, but it really wasn't until post-college, 2016, that I began to dig in, well, what does this stuff actually mean? That we had the seismic event of Donald Trump reshaping the Republican Party, and a lot of people were saying he is or isn't a conservative, and so I thought, well, he may or may not be a good candidate, but what does it mean for someone to be a conservative? Like, what does that actually mean? Everyone claims to be a conservative on the right, it seems, but they all have a different definition of it. And to be fair, let's be frank about this. There is no single definition. I don't think it'd be right of me to say such and so is or isn't a conservative. unless I'm going to define my terms, of course. And like I say, they don't live up to these particular standards. But what I had discovered, much to my surprise, was that the intellectual roots of the ideology, of the belief system, of the worldview are deep and beautiful and have been things that people have argued about at least since Socrates. But in more recent times, in modern times, under William F. Buckley and the National Review movement, conservatism, these are some incredibly brilliant thinkers, usually hard Marxists in their youth that disavow Marxism and then eventually come over to the political right, if you will. And the arguments they had between each other make our political discourse today just sounds like child's play. It lifts your soul and your spirit when you get to read individuals at such a higher caliber deeply arguing with fundamental truths about human nature and how that could be applied to society. And I think that was what Saving Elephants was born out of, and I'm a millennial, I'm an elder millennial, so I specifically wanted to tailor to my generation saying, look, this is a rich heritage. A lot of people call ourselves conservative, don't know what that means. Why not find out? Why not go read what the old timers said? And for those of you who don't have time reading, well, come listen to my podcast. I'll try to digest it, hopefully in a manner that's a little bit easier to understand and to mull over in your mind. Because I think that intellectual pursuit is desperately missing in our political discourse and can actually elevate things and can imbue our life with meaning and value.
I got you. That's all. That sounds good. I'll have to listen to it. Saving elephants. So I guess the elephant in the room is the Republicans, right?
It is a Republican Party. And I am of the opinion that Donald Trump, for all his faults and merits, is not a conservative in the traditional sense that I mean it. He doesn't, and I don't mean that as a criticism of him necessarily. I don't think he claims the term. The closest he ever come to it was once he called himself a nationalist or a populist, say. He certainly has some conservative intellectual, or I'll say leanings, not intellectual ties. But I think oftentimes Trump really is an individual who leads by his gut, his emotion. He has a strong sense of his brand being important, and he doesn't seem to have an ideological leaning. And so I think the right, and the Republican Party in particular, does itself a disservice by continuously trying to shackle this guy with a specific ideology or worldview. And as such, Saving Elephants is in part, I am trying to recall the Republican Party back to a specific conservative vision. Probably the closest we could get to it in modern times would be President Ronald Reagan. Not a perfect figure, but someone who I think emulated those conservative principles and values closer. And so I'm trying to say, look, these words actually mean something. They can be filtered through a party. It ought not to just be something that we say on Fox News, such and so is a conservative because they support Trump. What does that word actually mean? And that's what I'm trying to do by, you're right, saving the elephants is saving the Republican Party from itself, in a sense, trying to call it back to a classical conservative tradition that really was its roots.
Well, I know that we have senators like Lindsey Graham. He's our South Carolina representative.
You're in South Carolina, aren't you?
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, bless your heart. Okay, so he represents you.
Yeah. Oh, my God. And most people that I know that are diehard Republicans, he's identified as a rhino because he says he's a Republican, but he always votes positively for the bills that the Democrats come out with. Mm-hmm. And so everybody's heads are spinning and exploding every time, he does something stupid. Kind of like the melon felon who I like to talk about, President Trump. He's truly a blunt force instrument, right?
Yeah.
While I'm not personally, I'm not a fan of his, and I think a lot of that has to do with his personality. A lot of that has to do with that. I think he's a narcissist. He's got a narcissistic streak in him. He loves the camera. He loves to tweet, and he's definitely not in my mind, he's not your classical politician. He's not what's the word I'm looking for? Not Democrat, but a diplomat. He's not a diplomatic personality. And so anyway, I don't want to bash Trump. I think there are things that he's doing. Yeah, I was saying that he's a blunt force instrument, and he was voted into office literally because of his campaign promises of securing the border and whatever else it was that he campaigned on. I can't think of what it was right off the top of my head, but he's not a diplomat. He's not your typical. It's hard to put a finger on it. I think in a lot of ways he's doing a lot of good for the American people. Doge has obviously hit a nerve with a lot of Americans and a lot of people in the federal government. These agencies that were overstaffed or shouldn't have been in existence to begin with, they all got terminated. Elon Musk and his group went through with a sledgehammer and just started, killing things, right? And my only problem with that is while this may be good, because who doesn't want excessive federal spending or excessive state spending to end? Taxpayers' money are being allocated for projects and things that we don't approve of, right?
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, if you compare Donald Trump to Ronald Reagan or Eleanor Roosevelt or some of the big names, in our political history, he's certainly a different type of individual. And like I said, personally, I don't like him. He's not my favorite kind of guy, and I think it's more of a personality thing than a political thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so he's not there to be friends with everybody. He's the president of the United States. He's our executive leader, and I respect the office of the president. And I would like to think that everything he's doing is for the good of the American people. That remains to be seen. And I'm like, what happened during the first administration? In 2016 when Trump was in office, what happened to Doge then?
Right.
Why was political overspending and abuse of taxpayer dollars by all these different entities or agencies in the federal government, and for that matter, what's going on with Congress? Why didn't our elected leaders, for the people, these millionaires who have turned civil service into a career path? A lot of those people weren't millionaires when he got into office, but then we have special interest groups that are lining their pockets with cash
Mm-hmm.
so that they can get these special bills passed, in the Senate, which it's just ridiculous, And anyway, I could go off on a rant about all of that, and I'll stop.
I think we probably all could. I think you'd be hard pressed to find a person who doesn't have a strong opinion of Donald Trump, good or bad. Right. He's someone that almost demands you have a strong opinion. And I think, and I do too, I absolutely do, but I think there's also a potential danger there of getting absorbed into making Trump the center of all things. He wants to be, and often he is, but I think he is needlessly so. The problem with politics is you always have to ask the question, compared to what? 2024 election,
right?
Donald Trump. I did not vote for Donald Trump in 2016, 2020, 2024. I also didn't vote for the Democratic candidates in those years.
Right.
But I have good friends and relatives who voted for all of the above, right? Some for Trump, some for his opponents. Sure. And I respect and admire those people. Some of them I disagree with how they got to those conclusions, but there's a lot of people I'm like, you know what? I don't agree with your conclusion, but I can completely respect that. And these are, sure. We went through 3, I would call them Sophie choices years, where they're not a real good candidate here, right? And so I'm part of what I hope to do. I am very critical of Trump, and I think rightfully so. But I think one of the dangers is if we focus mostly on here's what's wrong and don't offer someone a positive vision, it's hard to build anything off of that. And particularly for myself and younger Americans, I've been paying attention to politics since I was a kid, so I'm an oddball. But a lot of my peers, and especially those coming up younger than I am, this is normal. This is what politics is. Obama, Trump, Biden, Hillary, to whatever degree she was sort of lurking in the wings forever. And what I desperately want younger Americans to know is this is not normal. This is a blip in history. This is the direction our country has gone. We can hope and expect better things from our leaders. We can hold them to a higher account. And that doesn't mean you have to be pro-Republican, pro-Democrat, or anti-Republican, anti-Democrat.
Right.
We could genuinely say, you know what? We're better than this. We have better leaders than this. And I think that combination of being both critical but also offering a positive vision and sometimes looking to our past to see examples of that, I really think that's how you build the future.
I struggle with the idea that the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, the best they could come up with was Donald Trump and Kamala Harris.
Right.
I voted for Trump in 2016 because I did not want Hillary Clinton to become the president,
right?
Any way, shape, form, or fashion, right? Because she was, in some ways, evil incarnate, right? And I say that tongue in cheek. She's not evil,
sure,
per se, but I certainly did not appreciate or support her politics or her political leanings, right? And so I was like, oh, screw that, I'll vote for Trump, because you're like, okay, so it's either Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. Which one? What's the best of both evils?
Right.
And so I voted for Donald Trump, and I didn't vote for Donald Trump this time. I didn't vote for either one of them, Kamala Harris or him. And that's the beautiful thing about democracy and being a constitutional or a constitutional republic, in that the people have the right and the ability and the privilege to vote your conscience, right?
Yeah.
And hopefully Americans, both young and old, are researching the candidates good and bad, pros and cons, and then come up with an educated decision. You know, I mean, that's the best we can do, right, in our political landscape.
And I will say, James, you probably know this, somewhat an anomaly there, because most of the people I know who voted for Trump in 2016 held out voting for him in 2020 and 2024. Not everybody, obviously, but a lot of them did. But it's different than, I say this all the time. Voting is just a single check box. You check a box once every 4 years. Okay, cool, whatever. That doesn't tell me everything I need to know about your character and your person. How you conduct yourself, right. The other days of those four-year period is far more important as far as I'm concerned. But I noticed a lot of my friends and family who in 2016 held their nose and voted for Trump for the exact reason you mentioned. Hillary Clinton was, I don't want Hillary Clinton to become president. I'm going to hold my nose and vote for this other guy. They have since morphed to where they're no longer critical of the positions Trump once held or the positions he has held or the things he's done. Now they're completely on board with him. And I think, unfortunately, cynicism can be a very difficult emotion to wrestle with. And I think sometimes people will reverse engineer their thinking to justify the vote they gave. Because we sort of hype this thing up that somehow by voting that tells me everything I need to know about your character. It really doesn't. It's important who we vote for, and you ought to do that with respect and integrity. But I think that you ought to be careful to say, you know what? I still want to hold this person's feet to the fire. I have not changed. My values are still the same, even if I recognize maybe that was the best of the two bad choices I was given.
Right. I just, as a boomer, I just get tired of the fact that our political parties can't come up with better choices for candidates. And it seems like, every time you start seeing, where there's smoke, there's fire, and so I always like to say, follow the money. Where's the money at? Where's the money going? Because usually that's the source of the motivation or drive for what's going on in whichever political party. And so I'm like, in our three-party system, Republican, Democrat, and Libertarian. Libertarian is there's no consequence. It seems like they never come up with a decent candidate. But it's like the only candidates that get put in front of the American people via broadcast TV and podcasting and all these different media outlets are those people that have the appropriate funding, PAC, super PAC, all that, all these different political funding engines that support the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate. And there have been, every 4 years there's a panel of candidates that go through vetting and they have conferences and they have people talk about their campaign strategy and where do you stand on this, where do you stand on that. And there have been some very, very intelligent people that I felt like in the past would have made an excellent candidate for the presidency, right? But for whatever reasons, and I think a lot of it boils down to money and support from their political party, the middleman, people like you and I will never have a chance to be president, right?
Right.
And
I'm okay with that, but I understand.
Yeah. Oh, it's not. Oh, absolutely. That's not a job I want.
Right.
Because every time a president gets into office, you look at Barack Obama. He was young, he was viral, he was full of energy, full of hope, and now he looks like an old man, right? You look at him, he's time doesn't wait on anybody, right? And there are untold stressors, and stress kills, and wow. Yeah, I absolutely wouldn't want the responsibility of being the commander in chief. No. But having said that, the people should be, putting people into office that can withstand that kind of pressure and be the diplomat we want them to be when it comes to the world arena, right? Going to all these different worldwide conventions and all of that. You would hope that our commander in chief would portray a polished political image that we could be proud of, right?
Yeah.
But anyway,
I would settle for, it doesn't have to be polished, but it needs to be consistent. And I think that's the thing that I fear the most is when our foreign policy is perceived to be arbitrary. That's really dangerous.
Right. I agree. Okay, so I have a lot of friends that are diehard MAGA supporters, right?
Same here. Hey, I'm in Oklahoma, you're in South Carolina. I'd find it weird if we didn't.
Right, exactly. And so I'm sure they're listening in. And I want to say hi to all my Second Amendment MAGA supporters out there. So now let me ask you a couple of these questions. How do conservative principles inform today's Second Amendment rights debate?
Wow, that's a broad question. I would say, I think we need to untangle first what conservative principles might inform Second Amendment rights to begin with. And conservatism is a broad worldview. And as such, I'm probably going to have to focus on just a few, say, key principles.
Sure. Sure.
But I would say that conservatism begins with general consensus around the notion that the good things we have in life can be taken from us quite easily. This is something the conservative philosopher Roger Scruton talked about. I think, I'm not quoting it exact, but something to the effect of almost all reasonable adults have a conservative impulse. I look around, I see these good things. These could be taken from me. It's hard to create a family. It's easy to lose one, right? It's hard to create a career. It's easy to lose one. And so therefore, my posture, my aim towards life is preservation. It's conservation. It's being careful. It's being mindful of taking care of the things I've been given, and also mindful of the fact that I didn't build most of it. I don't mean that in the Barack Obama sense. I mean that in the sense that we inherited our nation. We inherited our family, our faith traditions, right? These things have been handed. The most important things in our life are things that were here long before we arrived on the scene.
Oh,
and
sure.
all of this demands of us an obligation. It demands of us gratitude. It means the best posture to life is to be, first of all, thankful for what you have and to preserve it before you say, what's wrong with life and how do I fix it? You got to do that too. Justice is out there and we ought to be about fixing things, but you have to start with the posture of what's working. And so when we talk about something about the Second Amendment, I think first and foremost, what I think of is not gun rights per se, but what's behind the idea of gun rights, which is, I think first and foremost, it's speaking to what are our fundamental rights as just a human being, not only as an American, but as a human. And long before we ever invented the musket, we had the God-given right to defend ourselves. So in effect, the Second Amendment is at root, obviously it's talking about guns, it's the mechanism by which we understand it today, but really at root what it's referring to is the right of self-defense. It's the right for me to protect those things that are mine. It's one of the ways in which I do show gratitude and conservation. And it's something that acknowledges that, yes, there are instances in which that right can be violated. For example, if I commit a capital crime, the state can lock me up. If we're at war, a foreign power can attack me. But under normal circumstances, the government and certainly other people have no right to harm those things that belong to me. And I have a right to defend myself in the process. Precisely what that looks like, and here again, I think is where conservatism can be helpful. I think these rights are born out of our traditions. And so it might look a little bit different in Oklahoma, how we define that, than South Carolina. I don't necessarily believe that the Second Amendment means every human being on earth has the exact right to a musket in the exact same sense. To a limited degree, sure, but what about 10,000 years ago when these weapons didn't exist? The right was still there, but how it was exercised might look a little different. And so that's, right. I think, sort of a recognition that sometimes we can't perfectly enforce rights through governments. We have to do it via consensus. We have to do it via federalism. We have to do it via the fact that we have a limited nature, and we're trying to, in our imperfection, to get as close to the perfect right, if you will, knowing that we'll never completely get there. Probably a lot more I could say there, but I probably said enough. So let me just stop there and see if I'm heading in the direction you're hoping.
Yeah, that was good. Liberty and gun rights is a very, very broad topic. And I'm thinking maybe that's one of the reasons why I'm having a difficult time pinning down qualified guests like yourself, because there's just so much there that you can talk about. And I'm actually thinking about rebranding it into something else altogether.
You have any ideas in mind what that would be?
No, I don't. But I'm spending a lot of mental energy trying to reconcile the difficulty I'm having of finding quality guests to come on and talk about liberty or gun rights or the Constitution or politics or whatever. And you would think I would have no problem getting guests, and it's turned out to be quite the opposite. So, but anyway, you're here, and that's the important thing. You're like the guest I want.
Well, I'm happy to hear it.
Yeah. So, question 2, what lessons can be drawn from key conservative thinkers on civil liberties? Now, the first thing that pops into my mind is Martin Luther King, right? He was a staunch advocate of civil liberties, right? Who else comes to mind when we talk about conservative thinkers on civil liberties?
That is, and I don't think you intended it to be this, that is a very complicated question. And I say that because when someone asks who comes to mind when you put together the concept of conservative leaders and civil liberties, unfortunately, it's not always the best history. And I think one thing that's very important for conservatives to do, especially younger conservatives, because it is undeniable the United States is becoming increasingly more culturally and especially ethnically diverse. Conservatism cannot be something that only applies to people with our skin complexion, right? It's got to be a message that works for minority groups as well. And I think the first way you get there is to acknowledge that conservatism did get some things wrong in the past. One of those things wrong was its stances towards civil liberty to a degree. Now, I don't go as far as the left did, that they would explain everything through say, like a racist lens, and say that conservatism had nothing of value to offer in the argument of civil liberties, say, via the 60s, say. But specifically, the two figures that would come to mind, probably when in most people's mind, they're thinking about the history, being William F. Buckley and the former presidential candidate Barry Goldwater. There we go. I was blanking on his name all of a sudden. They were around the same era.
Okay.
Barry Goldwater was most famous or infamous for, I mean, he did a lot of great things. I think he would have made a decent president. I certainly think he would have made a better president than LBJ at the time. But he was, politically speaking, on the wrong side of the civil rights debate for the right reasons. He took a wrong position for the right reasons. In my view, Goldwater was not a racist. But what he effectively was saying was, we can't put civil liberty solely in the hands of the federal government. It can't just be a Supreme Court decision. It can't just be through Congress. We have to respect states' rights. We have to allow states to work this out slowly through process. And so as a result, he stood against a lot of the civil rights legislation of the 60s. Again, he was wrong on that issue for the right reasons. It was a federal overreach. And we have suffered some of the consequences because of that. It's opened the Pandora box for all sorts of things, such as quotas, for instance. But I personally believe it was also undeniable that good came of it, that the ability to enact civil liberties produced good too. And this is the great struggle within conservatism. We want to innovate. We want to progress. We want to be going forward. We also want to be careful about the traditions we've come from. And we want to be careful with how quickly we're going forward and listen to all voices. And where exactly, when you lean to one side or the other, there's a tension there. And I think, all that being said, I do think as of today, we ought to be able to look to conservatism and see that wrestled within it, there is a strong argument for civil liberties, because within conservatism, we recognize that people have value as individuals, right? We're not collective. When you look at the radical left today, it's the precise opposite of the Martin Luther King arguments of civil liberty, right? The famous, I want to be judged by the quality of my character, not the color of my skin. Precise opposite of some of the radical left. They've gone completely 180 degrees. So I think there's much to be celebrated within conservatism that can say, look, we may have gotten some of those policies wrong for the right reasons, but our underlying beliefs allow us to see humans, regardless of their skin color, as truly equal in the eyes of God and truly equal on a moral plane. And so therefore, we ought to allow everyone to have equal opportunities, to access to things, to allow them to better themselves, not equal outcomes. We don't want to enforce, how everybody is going to perform, but we want to give people the ability to perform, and that includes civil liberties, right? It includes the ability to look beyond someone's race. And I really think things like the free market, I think things like a conservative traditional understanding can aid that along. It's not a hindrance, chiefly.
You're a little bit over my head with some of that, but that's good stuff.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I wanted to be careful in the event because, as I said at first, there are some friends of mine on the left, good people, who this is their number one problem with conservatism, is its unwillingness to acknowledge some of its sins of the past, the ways in which it did align itself with the more racist elements of our past. Again, I don't go as far as the left did. I think it's not just that, but I think being able to acknowledge that and say, yes, that happened, and here's how it wasn't just that, is the best way we can actually have to persuade our friends on the left that maybe conservatism has a point to it.
Right. Absolutely. I'm stealing these questions off your Podmatch profile, by the way.
Fair enough. I forgot I wrote them on there. Hopefully
No, these are great questions. Great questions. Okay. How can conservatism address the political divide in America today?
Oh, that's a great question, right? I think it's undeniable we're divided as a country. I celebrate the fact that this is an issue that you can go out there and you talk to your friends on the left or the right, and they all agree, right? It's not as if this is a partisan issue. Nobody's out there saying, there's nothing wrong with America's divisiveness. I think conservatism can help us by reorienting us towards human nature and trying to look through the lens of human nature to understand what's actually going on here. And I'm going to borrow a line from the conservative economist. He's in his 90s, but thank God he's still alive, Thomas Sowell. And he's talking about poverty and wealth. He says, a lot of people have the problem exactly backwards. They look around them and they ask, what causes poverty? So that's not the question. We know what causes poverty. We're born into a world of limits. Everyone is born in poverty, but for the fact that someone was helping them in some way. The real question is, what causes wealth? How do some people escape poverty? And by studying that, we can go a long way to alleviating poverty. And I think I would apply a similar mindset here. I don't think the question is so much why are we divided, but rather why weren't we divided at certain periods in our history? Because I think what we're trying to do here in the United States, a wonderful, beautiful thing, is live a very unnatural life of self-government. I say it's unnatural because prior to the United States, other than tiny little pockets in Greece or Holland or the United Kingdom, you really don't see it on the throughout history. Most of the time we were warring tribes or monarchs or other forms of statist control. So what we're trying to do doesn't really square with our human nature. What the founders gave us, though, was this beautiful formula, federalism. And it tried to help divide up, okay, some issues make sense to take care of at a national level. But if it doesn't make sense, then knock it down to the state or to the local government. And so this
Right.
I think, reorienting ourselves with this idea of our human nature is constantly going to make us war with each other. There's 330 million Americans. We're never going to agree. But we might be able to find a way to work together in spite of our disagreements through a federal system so that you in South Carolina might find another way of doing something we do in Oklahoma, and that's okay. There are some issues that are national, and they're going to have to be. For the most part, it would be good if we would let states and local governments figure these issues out for themselves. And I really think conservatism encourages a person to look at life that way.
Gotcha. Yeah. I think one of the things that comes to mind with regards to states taking care of things is like the abortion issue, Planned Parenthood, and women's rights,
Mhm.
right, to their body, and the right to make a health decision that is appropriate for them and their family. Right. I don't think the federal government should be implementing sweeping bills that makes it illegal for a woman to have an abortion. Now, I am not pro-abortion. I believe there are other options. I think there's adoption and other things, and I understand that it's a complex issue, and that you have rape, incest, and other things that happen that causes pregnancies, and maybe in those instances it's allowable,
Mhm.
right? Who am I as a man, to sit in judgment of this family or this woman making a decision to have an abortion because of what has happened, this god awful traumatic incident in their lives that's created this pregnancy, But I think that's a great example of where the states need to iron out all of those decisions, right, and those laws.
I think Abraham Lincoln.
There's probably others.
Yeah, there are probably others, but I think you're right. That's maybe the best example we can look at and say, here's an example of it. Abraham Lincoln, former president, I think is probably one of the greatest examples of American prudence put into practice, because Lincoln had to deal with two seemingly impossible contradictions. One being the equality of man. Black people are as equal as white people. It is slavery is an affront and all the racism that goes with it. But the other
Right.
was the consent of the governed. Just because something was right didn't mean some general could get into his head and suddenly force people to start behaving a certain way. So where exactly do you cross the line between when can you enforce something? And I think that, Lincoln did it ultimately. It cost 500,000 dead Americans and the destruction of the Southern way of life and economy. I'm not saying I'm against it. I think the Civil War ultimately had the ending it needed to, but it was destructive and it was difficult. And I think there are a lot of individuals who, with the issue of abortion, need to recognize the moment we're in. There is not the kind of national consensus that could allow for a federal response to this question. That's not the same as saying you can't have a strong conviction whether or not abortion rights or the right to life is key or most important. But it means we need to recognize as a nation state, we don't currently have the capacity to just force this will upon all the states. And you're right, maybe working at it from a federal level, from a state level, a local level, might be the way we could build consensus eventually. But I think it's necessary to start there, because we are in such a habit in this nation of we elect one guy and then we, through executive orders, just turn on a dime and go this direction. And then the nation gets fed up with that, and then we turn on a dime and go the other direction. And gone are the days of just building consensus through slow deliberation. I mean, and one of the things that Roe v. Wade did was it kept a cap on our abortion debate for 50 years, right? And so we're having to scrunch a 50-year debate now into just a couple of years. I think it'll eventually work itself out, but we're just very much at the front end of this thing.
Right. Probably so. Yeah. When that got overturned, people's heads were exploding, and it was and is still ugly.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, discuss the role of civil discourse in maintaining constitutional rights.
So I think maybe the easiest way I could say this is, in a nation of self-government, the most important thing is that we govern ourselves, right? There is an unfortunate, this is where I depart from libertarians. I love libertarians. I think they have a lot of things right. I think, unfortunately, though, libertarians oftentimes live in a more utopic world than what I imagine really exists. Because there is, in my view, a direct relationship between the health of the human soul and the ability to live in liberty. Liberty, yes, is a right, but how do you exercise and realize that right? You need courage. You need strength. You need character. You need the ability to compromise and work with other individuals, and not simply just in a selfish manner take everything you can and enforce your will on others. If you have an entire nation state of people who don't sign up to that, who lack these small r Republican virtues that our founding fathers talked about, I don't care what your politics looks like, you're not going to have liberty. And I think civil discourse is an incredibly important part of that. The ability to just have good faith conversation with other people, sort of the opposite of what we see on social media, to be frank. And it's okay. Right. You can have some of that. We have always, look, if you look at our history, we have always had hotheads saying the most vicious, hurtful things to the other side politically. That's human nature. It's never going to go away. But there has to be an underlying bedrock of some sort of mechanisms or ability to converse, to actually think the person who disagrees with me is not Satan incarnate. He's just wrong, right? He could be wrong about something. That doesn't mean I have to hate him. Doesn't mean he's subhuman somehow. And I think there are and they take a lot of forms. Congress is one of them. What we're doing is one of them. Talking to your neighbor is one of them. Just the ability to have conversations at various degrees of people you have a little bit of friction with, don't necessarily agree with. I think that has to happen in order for liberty to persist.
Yeah, I think, over the years, let's talk about the workplace. What are the two topics that are forbidden for you to talk about in a workplace?
Politics and religion.
There you go. Politics and religion. And why is that? Because we're all passionate about what we believe about our politics and religion, right? And I have found over the last 40 years of working in corporate America that it's not a topic that you bring up on your own. And as you develop work relationships and friendships at work, you find those individuals that are like-minded, right? You can go to lunch and you find that you can, as world events are unfolding and we're watching TV, watching newscasts, listening to podcasts, listening to the radio, whatever, you can't escape it. It's everywhere. It's all around us. It's like we're part of the instant gratification, instant information age that an elephant in Uganda can't fart without the rest of us knowing about it, right? Right? Somebody's gonna have their smartphone and they're gonna be going, "Oh, look, that elephant just farted, and I don't think he farted in the right way, and he farted too much, and oh my God, it stinks." They get on TikTok, and all of a sudden, millions of people are watching this video about this elephant, farting in Uganda, and we're like, "What? Why do we even?" Why do we even care? And I know that's a ridiculous example, to make a point.
It's not too ridiculous given today's political discourse.
Yeah. So narrowing in on civil discourse, we have to somehow we've got to get away from the emotions, right? It's okay to be passionate about your belief system. It's okay to be passionate about your political stance. But when it comes to having a civil discourse with other people that don't agree with us, we have to understand that they are passionate too. They're passionate about their beliefs. And at some point, we have to figure out a way to intellectualize and get to a little higher level than our base emotions, right? And we have to figure out a way to talk through these issues and come up with solutions that everybody can compromise on. Compromise in such a way that solutions come up. And we come up with solutions to the problems that are facing us. And there's a whole plethora of social issues that are surrounding us, right? Political issues, religious issues, social issues. I could talk for an hour just on that, but I think that's...
Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No, you're fine. I just wanted to kind of narrow down, discuss the role of civil discourse in maintaining constitutional rights. Well, our Constitution is there because we had to kick King George or whoever he was, out of the colonies and go, yeah, we're not living like this, and we fought a hard fought, war. The Constitution was written by our forefathers. We have the Bill of Rights. We have all of those things in place in our constitutional republic because there were tyrants, from another country that was like, you're going to serve me. And we were like, no, we're not. We're not going to serve you. And we don't believe what you believe. And, they had the Tea Party and all of the, the rebellion. Thank God, all the patriots that stood up and said, "No, I'm willing to shed my blood here on this continent to keep you from doing what you're doing." And so we smacked them around and sent them where they needed to go.
It's a heritage we can be proud of, and I want to be clear. By the way, when I was speaking about, I didn't say anything I don't think I should have, but I think it could be misinterpreted. I don't mean to imply that everybody listening needs to go stop what they're doing and have a really difficult conversation with their boss or some friend about politics. I think we also use prudence and discretion. But I think if I could if I can implore the listener, what I would hope you would do is maybe even turn down your passion, turn up your gratitude, turn up your sobriety. This is serious business. This is important. Turn down the heat. Just because it's important doesn't mean it's all important. And maybe the best way to have a conversation sometimes is not to have one. If you're the sort of person that doesn't do well on social media, get off social media. You're not saving the world by screaming at strangers, right?
Right.
And so you need to use discretion for yourself. If you cannot engage in good faith in a conversation with someone you disagree with and really want what's best for them and see their humanity, then you probably don't need to be in that conversation. But if you can, it's important, and you should press in.
Well, I have a pastor friend. We attended his church for 10 or 15 years, and he does not engage in political or religious discourse especially on social media. And he made a good point. He said, "Now I think Twitter has increased I think the limit was 140 characters, right?
Yeah, doubled it essentially.
And they doubled it, and it's like the good thing about having 140 characters on Twitter to make your point is that you couldn't chase rabbits. You couldn't get on a tirade. You had to think about what you were going to say and make a concise, informed comment on whatever it was, right? And one of the things he said was that in good conscience, I cannot engage an issue being limited to 140 characters, right? And I think there was a lot of wisdom there. It's like you said, why are we screaming at strangers on the internet? That reminds me of the BBS days, right, where people had logged into BBS systems and were able to download files and get into chats. And there was I can't even remember what it was. There was this FidoNet. There was a messaging system called FidoNet where there were all kinds of messaging, political, religious, whatever, and there was a whole spectrum of things that you could talk about. And oh my God, that's where the term flame wars came from. And I'm kind of dating myself. You might not even, you probably never even were part of that, but maybe you've heard of it. But I got into flame wars with non-Christians. I ran a BBS called Jesus Connect. And I had several friends of mine that had different flavors of Christian BBSs where people could log in and do all those things. And I spent a lot of time on a keyboard, screaming at strangers in the internet about my faith, right? And you just get worn out by all of that. Yeah. At some point you're like, okay, I think I've said all that I can say. My position. We can either agree to disagree or not.
And I think one of the things, James, that shows is a conservative principle. There are a lot of things that evolve in life. Human nature really isn't one of them. Now, we can go through periods of high culture or low culture, but we're pretty much the same basic material. I mean, we know this in Christianity, right? We don't evolve into some higher being at some point. We're the same basic crap that we started off with, that fortunately we have better angels of our nature. God has imbued us with, what is the phrase? God's image upon us. There are things we can be called to higher stations, but we're also subjectable to these same, all these. The only thing that's really changed is the technology, the means and the accessibility and the speed with which we can communicate this. That same basic impulse was always there. But I think within that, there's hope. We can be held to account. We can expect better of our leaders and of ourselves. We don't have to just use this as an excuse.
Right. Okay, so the last question. What hopes, you said that word, no pun intended. What a wonderful segue. What hopes exist for a unified future of conservatism and individual freedoms? That was a mouthful.
Yeah, I did say the word hope, and I think the word hope is important. One of the best conservative thinkers alive today, in my opinion, is Yuval Levin. He's a few years older than I am, so I really hope the guy keeps writing books because he's brilliant. And he makes this point.
What's his name?
Yuval Levin, not to be confused with Mark Levin.
Oh, okay.
His most recent book was American Covenant. It talks about the importance of the Constitution, but if you can get him on the program, he's definitely worth talking to. The guy's brilliant. But he makes this point very often that his goal is not to be optimistic about the future. Optimistic is just expecting good things to happen. And he says, if you really think about that for half a second, that's kind of an absurd viewpoint. So is pessimism. We don't know what the future will hold, but he wants to be hopeful about the future, which means not so much we expect good things to happen, but that we have a posture that we have some role to play in the world ahead. We have some responsibility. Wrong. Going on over here. That's what I mean is for some reason it sounds...
All right, so to my listening audience, I'm going to say thank you for the privilege of your time. Josh Lewis, thank you for your insights, and I thoroughly enjoyed talking to you about liberty and gun rights and conservatism and politics and all of the above.
Hey, absolutely, James. As someone who spends most of my time talking to millennials on podcasts, it's great to see there's boomers out there doing the same thing. We're all Americans. We're all in this together.
That's right. So our podcast is hosted on Captivate FM, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, iHeartRadio. I also upload the video version of this podcast episode to rumble.com and my YouTube channel. You can contact me at Liberty Gun Rights Podcast at proton.me. That's Liberty Gun Rights Podcast at proton.me. And don't forget the podcast called Saving Elephants by Josh Lewis. And is there a website, or they can just go to Apple Podcasts and search for Saving Elephants?
I think most podcast platforms you could just search Saving Elephants. I do have a website because I'm competing with people trying to save like real elephants. You're gonna have to go to savingelephants.blog. All
right, let's see if I can find that. Saving Elephants blog.
Yes, sir.
There we go. I found it. So let me share it real quick. Share and window, and there we go.
That's it.
So savingelephants.blog.com. I was just sitting here thinking about my analogy about the elephant in Uganda farting. And everybody
I was wondering if that's
TikTok
where you were
video.
going with it, and then no, you went a different direction.
So, no, this is great. Look at this. Listen to the podcast, read the blog, watch video clips, subscribe. You're on Substack too. That's awesome. Yeah, Millennials Reigniting Classical. Gonna keep trying to. I'm on the wrong screen. Millennials Reigniting Classical Conservatism.
It's a mouthful.
Yes, it is a mouthful. But anyway, the listening audience, if you're watching the video episode, you can see his Josh Lewis's Welcome to Saving Elephants blog.com. And if you're interested, please visit and contribute in some way to this effort. Yay. Yeah, I like that. That's very good. And I'll put that in the show notes.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. So thank you for tolerating my senior brain farts here. Appreciate you. Thank you for being here, and we'll talk to y'all later. Bye-bye.